On the afternoon of the 12th of May 1987, 4 days after the SAS had killed 8 men of the East Tyrone Brigade and 1 civilian outside the Loughgall RUC station, Gerry Adams put his shoulder under the lead coffin at Carrickmore and helped carry it toward the grave. Martin McGuinness took the corner opposite. They walked beneath the tricolour for the man at the front, Patrick Kelly. The press photograph from that day was published in every paper in Ireland the next morning. None of those papers had read the document that would surface in the Glasgow Herald 30 years later. It said that the man carrying the front left corner of Patrick Kelly's coffin was the man who had warned the British that Patrick Kelly was on his way to Loughgall. That document was a short page in a Department of Foreign Affairs file in Dublin. It was released on the 29th of December 2017 under the 30-year rule, in the same package of papers that contained a separate letter from the Northern Ireland Secretary Tom King to the Tánaiste Brian Lenihan, dated the 20th of May 1987. The Tom King letter said that the 8 weapons recovered from the dead at Loughgall had been used in every single murder and attempted murder in Fermanagh and Tyrone that year, and a good many further afield. It said the group had, in the British view, at least 40 to 50 killings to its name. The Faul rumour did not need that letter to make its point. It made its point on its own. The man who said it was a priest in Dungannon called Denis Faul. The men he named, by implication, were the man at the head of the coffin and the man on the corner opposite. Adams, McGuinness. This is the story behind that photograph. We are not going to retell the 17 minutes outside the police station. That story has been told. We are going to tell the story of the 18 months before, when 2 factions inside the same organisation disagreed about how to win, and one of them stopped being a problem at 7:01 on the evening of the 8th of May, on the road into Loughgall, with 24 men of 22 SAS lying in a hedgerow. Patrick Kelly was 30 years old at his death. He was born on the 19th of March 1957 in Carrickfergus in County Antrim, on the coast east of Belfast. He had grown up in a Catholic family of 5 children, the oldest. His uncle, Liam Kelly, had been a Republican activist of an earlier generation. By 1985, Patrick Kelly had moved to Dungannon and taken over the East Tyrone Brigade as officer commanding. He had built it, in the 2 years since, into the most operationally active brigade in the entire provisional IRA outside Belfast. The man at his side, at the head of the column, Jim Lynagh, was 31, a Sinn Féin councillor for Monaghan Urban District Council, in the chamber since 1979. The Royal Ulster Constabulary called him the Executioner. Lynagh had been in prison from 1975 to 1979 and had spent the 4 years reading Mao Zedong on guerrilla warfare. He had come out with a doctrine. He had partnered with Padraig McKerney from 1984, and the doctrine had a name and a set of steps. They called it the 3rd phase, the strategic defensive, and the idea was simple. You did not negotiate. You did not contest elections. You destroyed the stations. You drove out the contractors who came to rebuild them. You held the ground. You created what Lynagh called liberated zones, area by area, parish by parish, until the British Crown could not staff a police station east of the River Bann. The doctrine had the strategic logic of Mao's Yan'an period and the practical air of a farmer's plan. Patrick Kelly was, in 1985, building the unit that would test it. Padraig McKerney, 32, from Moy in County Tyrone, was, in 1985, writing the plans. Padraig's older brother Tommy was already in prison for life. His younger brother Sean had been killed on IRA active service in 1974. The family had buried 2 men for the cause already. They were about to bury a third. In the summer of 1986, the East Tyrone Brigade tested the doctrine. They had tested it once before at Ballygawley in December 1985 with a two-team assault on the RUC barracks. Gunmen at the front, a bomb at the back, 2 officers dead. They had taken notes. They had refined. On the 11th of August 1986, at the Birches, a few miles north of Portadown in North Armagh, they ran the refined version. They hijacked a JCB digger from a contractor's yard. They packed 200 pounds of explosives into the bucket in the form of an oil drum bound with primer cord. They raked the RUC barracks with automatic gunfire. They drove the digger through the perimeter fence. The bomb destroyed most of the building. It blew the roof off the pub across the road. 3 civilians were injured. The base had been unmanned. The unit got out in a small boat across Lough Neagh, the inland lake whose western shore is County Tyrone and whose eastern shore is County Antrim, a body of water large enough to swallow a small boat in the dark. A diversionary bomb went off at Pomeroy, 15 miles to the west, to draw the security forces the other way. The whole operation involved at least 4 teams: lookouts, the armed approach team, the bomb crew, and the diversion. Mark Urban, the journalist, in his 1992 book Big Boys Rules, later called it the rehearsal. The British called it the template. The East Tyrone Brigade called it proof of concept. Patrick Kelly commanded the operation. Declan Arthurs, 21 years old, an agricultural contractor from Galbally who had grown up on diggers on his father's farm, was the driver. 8 months later, at Loughgall, Patrick Kelly was the commander again. Declan Arthurs was the driver again. Almost everything was the same, except the building was manned and the men inside were not the RUC. What changed in those 8 months was not the East Tyrone Brigade. What changed was West Belfast. On the 16th of October 1986, the IRA's General Army Convention met for the first time in 16 years. It was, in the constitutional ordering of the Provisional Movement, the body that ranked above the Army Council, which ranked above the Northern Command, which ranked above the brigades. The convention met in secret, somewhere south of the border. It passed 2 motions. The first allowed Sinn Féin to discuss taking seats in the Dáil. The second removed the long-standing IRA ban on supporting any candidate who would. Between those 2 motions, the constitutional cover for the political track had been laid down. 2 weeks later, on the 1st and 2nd of November 1986, the Sinn Féin Ardèche met at the Mansion House in Dublin. 630 delegates filed into the building. 2 days later, 429 of them voted to end abstentionism, to allow Sinn Féin members elected to the Dáil to actually take their seats. 161 voted against. The motion passed by exactly 10 votes more than the 2/3 majority it needed. Rory O'Brodig, the man who had been Sinn Féin's president when Gerry Adams was a child, walked out of the hall with about 100 others, including Dochie O'Connell, the former vice-president. They went and founded Republican Sinn Féin in a hotel later that afternoon. The man whose stage management had carried the motion was Gerry Adams. He was 38. He had been president of Sinn Féin for 3 years, since the 13th of November 1983. He had been the Member of Parliament for West Belfast for 3 years and 5 months, elected on the 9th of June 1983. He had not taken his seat in Westminster, but he had spent 3 years building the institutional machinery to take it. He had, in the assessment of a Department of Foreign Affairs official sent to observe the Ardèche, and recorded in the same archive that would later hold Denis Faul's rumour, run the conference floor with the kind of confidence that comes only when the count has already been done. The vote in Dublin was the moment Sinn Féin formally became the political wing of a movement that intended to win at the ballot box. It was also the moment the East Tyrone Brigade stopped being the future of the war and started being the past of it. Jim Lynagh did not vote at the Ardèche. He was in Monaghan, planning. Padraig McKinney was in Tyrone, planning. They had not signed on to the long war, becoming a long talk. They had a doctrine they believed in, and the doctrine required the destruction of police stations, not the contesting of seats. According to a priest in Dungannon who had taught Padraig McKinney at St Patrick's Academy, Lynagh and McKinney had begun saying things in the spring of 1987 that would, if true, have made them the second most dangerous men in Ireland to Gerry Adams. They had begun to say, the priest wrote, that they would execute him. The priest's name was Denis Faul. He passed the comment 3 months after the 8 men of the East Tyrone Brigade were dead in a Toyota van outside the Loughgall RUC station to a civil servant in the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. That comment is the document. That is what surfaced in 2017. That is the file the audience has been pointing at under the existing videos on this channel for 2 years. It was filed at the National Archives in Dublin under the reference 2017/4/74. The wording, recorded by the civil servant who took the meeting, has been quoted in every Irish paper that covered the December 2017 release. The relevant sentence is short. It said, "The rumour doing the rounds was that the IRA team was set up by Gerry Adams himself." Now look back at the photograph from Carrickmore. Patrick Kelly's coffin, the tricolour, the 8 pallbearers, the 2 pallbearers at the front, walking shoulder to shoulder. The 38-year-old president of Sinn Féin in a dark suit, his hand under the corner. The man who in 3 days' time would stand at Loughgall Cemetery in Monaghan and give the oration at Jim Lynagh's grave. The man who had defended, at 35, the armed struggle as the only engine that could finish the war. The man who at 38 had moved past that, walking the coffin of the brigade commander who had built his career on the doctrine that the president of Sinn Féin was, in May 1987, in the process of abandoning. That is the photograph. That is the document. That is the story. The next question is whether the document is right. 2 things have to be said about Denis Faul before we ask that question. Faul was a serious man. He was born in 1932. He was ordained in 1956. He had taught at St Patrick's Academy in Dungannon for 30 years by the time of Loughgall, including teaching Padraig McKinney. He had spent every one of the years of the Troubles writing pamphlets, 150 of them with Father Raymond Murray, the chaplain at Armagh Women's Prison, detailing British Army and RUC abuses of Catholic civilians. He marched at Derry in 1968. He visited internees at Long Kesh in 1971. He went to court to challenge the supergrass system in 1982. He was, in the language of the period, a civil rights priest in the strict sense of the term. He was not pro-British. He was not pro-Sinn Féin either. The second thing has to be said because the first thing might mislead you. By 1987, Father Faul and the Provisional Movement were, in the phrase of Ed Maloney, at daggers drawn. The dispute had begun 6 years earlier, during the second hunger strike, when Faul had gone behind the IRA Army Council's back and persuaded the families of dying men to take their sons off the strike. Adams and the leadership had not forgiven him. Faul had not forgiven Adams. By 1987, Faul believed, and would tell anyone who asked, that Adams had let men die in 1981 for political advantage. So when Faul carried a rumour to the Department of Foreign Affairs in August 1987, his motive was not neutral. He believed Adams capable of betraying men for political gain. He had, in his own view, watched him do exactly that. Both of those facts have to sit on the same page. What the file does not say, the script will not say. The file does not say that Gerry Adams was a British intelligence asset. It does not say he was paid. It does not say he held a code name. It does not say he met a handler. It records that a priest in Dungannon told an Irish civil servant in August 1987 that the theory doing the rounds in Tyrone was that the IRA team was set up by Gerry Adams himself. That is the limit of what the document does. Anyone who tells you the document says more is telling you what they wish the document said. The other document in the same release is, in its way, harder to dismiss. On the 20th of May 1987, 12 days after the ambush, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Tom King, wrote to the Tánaiste of Ireland, Brian Lenihan. The letter said, in plain prose, "The weapons recovered from the dead at Loughgall were responsible for every single murder and attempted murder in Fermanagh and Tyrone in 1987. The letter said the group had, in King's view, at least 40 to 50 killings to its score over the years. The letter is held, as part of the same December 2017 release, in the British State Papers reaching back to the Cabinet Office. It is not a rumour. It is an estimate by the senior British minister responsible for the province, written within a fortnight of the killings, with the recovered weapons in police custody. That figure, 40 to 50 murders, every single shooting in those two counties for the year, is the operational reality the political level conversation in West Belfast had to weigh against the political level vote in Dublin. The East Tyrone Brigade had been the engine of the war in mid-Ulster. The unit standing at the front gate of Loughgall police station with a digger and a Toyota van had, between the 8 men in it, killed, in the British view of it, some 50 people. Patrick Kelly had built that unit. Jim Liner had supplied the doctrine. Padraig McGuinness had drawn the plans. And they had, between November 1986 and May 1987, made themselves the public face of opposition inside the movement to everything Gerry Adams was building in Dublin. The Tánaiste Brian Lenihan wrote back to King a few days later, asking him to be mindful, his phrase, of the need to avoid any sense of triumphalism on the part of your authorities. Lenihan was thinking about the funerals. The funerals had not yet happened. They were 5 days away. The funerals began on the 13th of May, 1987. Patrick Kelly was buried in Edendork Cemetery, 2 miles from his home in Dungannon. His funeral was the largest Republican funeral seen in Tyrone for years. Gerry Adams was a pallbearer. Martin McGuinness was a pallbearer. The photograph that would later be printed by every paper in Ireland, the photograph the audience under the channel's existing Loughgall videos still references 37 years later, is the photograph of those 2 men at the head of the coffin, shoulder to shoulder, walking the tricolour draped box toward the grave. The funeral passed off without incident. Brian Lenihan's letter had had its effect. The British forces stayed out of sight. 2 days later, on the 15th of May, Gerry Adams gave the oration at the grave of Jim Liner at Loughgall Cemetery in Monaghan town. About 2,000 mourners attended. Liner's coffin was carried by 8 masked IRA volunteers in black berets and white shirts. There was no rifle volley over the grave. The stewards from Sinn Féin had ruled the volley out because of the risk of arrest. Adams stood at the graveside in front of the family Liner had left behind. He said, on the public record, with his voice carried by every reporter in attendance, "Anyone who does business with the British, the SDLP, or the Free State establishment are fools, as they've all sold out on the Irish people." That is the man who had spent the previous October stage managing the vote in Dublin that would, over the next 12 years, put Sinn Féin into the Free State establishment, then into government with the SDLP at Stormont, then into a settlement guaranteed by the British government, and finally, in 2007, into a coalition with the Democratic Unionist Party itself. The man who stood at Loughgall in May 1987 and called the political track a betrayal was the man who in November 1986 had voted to start it and would, by December 1999, be a participant in it. The other 6 funerals went through Tyrone over the following days. Padraig McKinness was buried at Moy, where 2 of his brothers were already buried. Sean, killed in 1974, and Kevin, murdered later by loyalists. His older brother Tommy, who would later write a book about the IRA from the inside, was at the graveside. Declan Arthurs and Seamus Donnelly were buried side by side in St John's Cemetery, Galbally. Donnelly was 19, the youngest of the 8. Arthurs was 21. Eugene Kelly's funeral was at Galbally as well. Gerard O'Callaghan was buried at Benburb. Tony Gormley was buried in Tyrone. Anthony Hughes, the civilian, was buried separately in Caledon. His brother Oliver, the man in the passenger seat who had been shot 14 times by SAS rifles and survived, would attend funerals like that for 23 more years before dying in 2010, having never received a British apology in his lifetime. The pallbearer photograph from Dungannon was the cover photograph. The 8 coffins were the operational story. The Faul rumour, filed away in a Dublin office until 2017, was the political story. What the document does, in 2017, is line up the 2 stories side by side and ask the reader to look at them. If you take the document at its face, which is, again, the face of a rumour, not the face of a finding, then what you are reading is this. In the spring of 1987, 2 men in the East Tyrone Brigade, Jim Lynagh and Padraig McKinness, had begun saying that they would execute the president of Sinn Féin. In May 1987, both of those men were dead, alongside Patrick Kelly and 5 others, killed by an SAS ambush at a police station whose attack had been predicted with such precision that 24 soldiers were lying in a hedgerow when the Toyota van turned the corner. 4 days later, the president of Sinn Féin, the man Lynagh had reportedly threatened, was a pallbearer at the funeral of the brigade commander who had agreed to the operation. 3 days after that, the same man was at the graveside in Monaghan, calling the British, the SDLP and the Free State sellouts, in front of a family that had, according to the priest who reported the rumour, intended to kill him. That is the reading of the document. It is not the only reading. Sinn Féin's reading, given to every reporter who phoned in December 2017, was that the rumour was utter nonsense. Gerry Adams's reading, given by his silence, he declined to comment, was that the document was beneath his attention. The reading of Richard English, the professor of politics at Queen's University Belfast, was that the intelligence at Loughgall had not come from inside the unit, but from electronic surveillance and from sources elsewhere, and that informer inside theories of the ambush, including this one, were weak. The reading of Mark Urban, the journalist who had been the first to write a full account of Loughgall in 1992, was, at the time, that there had been a human source. The reading of later intelligence historians has been that Urban was wrong, that the foreknowledge was electronic. The reading of Ed Maloney, the journalist who has spent more years on the inside of the Provisional Movement's records than any other person, is that the document records a serious rumour, but that there are other equally credible explanations: operational mistakes by the IRA team, surveillance density, informers in Tyrone unconnected to the leadership in Belfast. The script will not pretend that the document settles a question it does not settle. The document records the rumour. It does not adjudicate it. The audience can adjudicate it. The script is here to present what is on the record. What is on the record is this: Patrick Kelly's unit had attacked the same kind of building in the same way twice before. Ballygawley in December 1985, 2 RUC officers dead. The Birches in August 1986, the building destroyed. Loughgall in May 1987, a different outcome. The pattern was so visible that the British surveillance machine, the electronic side of it, the bug and camera side, the kind of work Mark Urban describes, have been logging the East Tyrone Brigade for at least 8 months by the time the Toyota turned the corner on the 8th of May. 24 SAS men cannot be put into a hedgerow without warning. They had warning. The British knew the brigade was coming. They knew, by the testimony of Mark Urban and Toby Harnden, what kind of vehicle, what kind of bomb, what kind of crew. They had taken every patrol out of the Loughgall area on the morning of Wednesday the 6th of May, 2 days before the attack. A withdrawal so noticeable that locals would later say they had felt the trap closing without knowing what was being trapped. The question is not whether the British had warning. They had warning. The question is whether the warning had a name on it. The Faul rumour says it had a name. The Faul rumour says the name was Adams. The men in the hedgerow that evening were soldiers of 22 SAS. The operation, in the British paperwork, was given the codename Operation Judy. There were 24 of them at 6 positions around the station. 6 of those were inside the building itself, in plain clothes, alongside 1 uniformed RUC officer and 2 officers of the RUC Headquarters Mobile Support Unit, the HMSU, the closest thing the RUC had to its own paramilitary tactical wing. The 18 outside were in concealed positions, in a row of trees and a hedgerow that ran along the road. They were armed mostly with Heckler & Koch G3 assault rifles, chosen on the British side for stopping power, because the brigade was known to wear body armour, and the lighter MP5 submachine gun was, in close range, judged insufficient. The British recovered 600 of their own cartridge cases from the ambush site afterwards. The IRA dead were carrying 8 firearms between them. 3 more Heckler & Koch G3 rifles of their own, a Belgian FNFAL, 2 Belgian FNFNCs, a Franke SPAS 12 shotgun, and a Ruger Security 6 revolver. Ballistic tests at the RUC laboratory in Belfast in the days after Loughgall linked those 8 weapons to 7 known murders and 12 attempted murders in mid-Ulster, and then, on review, to every single murder and attempted murder in Fermanagh and Tyrone for the calendar year. That was the sentence Tom King would write to Brian Lenihan on the 20th of May. That was the figure the British Cabinet Office held in its files for 30 years before it was released. What the rest of the documentary record around Adams says, what Brendan Hughes, the IRA commander in Belfast in the 1970s, said in his Boston College tapes before he died, is that Adams was the most ruthless operator inside the movement against his own. Hughes did not call him an informer. Hughes called him the man who ordered the disappearance of Jean McConville. Hughes called him the man who ordered the executions that the IRA later denied. Hughes broke with him publicly. Hughes died in 2008 with that record on tape. Adams has denied all of it. What Hughes did not say in his Boston College material, and what the published transcripts make clear he did not say, was that Adams was the source of any specific British operation. The accusation is of internal ruthlessness, not of foreign service. Eamon Collins, the IRA intelligence officer based in Newry, said something different but parallel, that the British had known about Loughgall for months. Collins, like Hughes, was killed for breaking with the movement, beaten to death on a road outside Newry on the 27th of January 1999. Collins did not name Adams either. Collins named the surveillance pattern. So what you have when you assemble the witnesses and the documents and the historians is the following. You have a priest in Dungannon with a deep grievance against the president of Sinn Féin, recording in August 1987 a rumour that names that president as the source of the betrayal. You have a Northern Ireland secretary in May 1987 saying the weapons were used in 50 killings. You have a Sinn Féin Ardèche in November 1986 that split the movement on the very question of whether men like the 8 at Loughgall represented the future or the past. You have an IRA commander in Belfast 10 years later characterising the man on the corner of Patrick Kelly's coffin as the most ruthless operator he ever served under. And you have an electronic surveillance system that by May 1987 did not need an informer at all to know the East Tyrone Brigade was on its way to a police station. The system had the pattern, the hedgerow had the soldiers. The Toyota turned the corner just after 7 on a Friday evening, and inside 2 minutes of British gunfire, 600 cartridge cases hitting the ground, a doctrine ended. The doctrine ended because the men who carried the doctrine were dead. The doctrine had ended in Dublin 6 months earlier, in a vote whose stage management was the work of the man on the corner of the coffin. Whether or not Gerry Adams personally gave the British the warning that put the SAS in the hedgerow at Loughgall, the strategic argument that the East Tyrone Brigade represented died the same day the East Tyrone Brigade did. From May 1987 onward, no faction inside the provisional movement was strong enough to oppose the political track. The Birches doctrine, the third phase, the liberated zones, they were a memory. The East Tyrone Brigade would suffer another 28 dead in the 5 years after Loughgall, the heaviest losses of any IRA brigade across that period. A series of ambushes and surveillance traps at Drumnachilly, Coe and Clonoe that read, in retrospect, as the British dismantling of the militant wing, one cell at a time. The back channel to MI6, the contacts that Brendan Duddy had been running in and out of Derry for 15 years, would warm up again. Michael Oatley, the MI6 officer who had run the back channel since 1973, would, in February 1991, sit down face-to-face with Martin McGuinness in a house in Derry. The first direct meeting between an MI6 officer and a senior member of the IRA Army Council since the failed truce of 1975. By the autumn of 1988, John Hume and Gerry Adams would be meeting in private at Clonard Monastery in West Belfast, on the floor that Father Alec Reid, the Redemptorist priest who had spent 20 years quietly working the ground, kept open for them. By the summer of 1994, the IRA would call a ceasefire. By April 1998, the Good Friday Agreement would be signed. By March 2007, the man on the corner of Patrick Kelly's coffin would sit down in front of a Northern Ireland Assembly chamber with the Democratic Unionist Party and agree to share government with them. The 8 men killed at Loughgall did not live long enough to see that. They had been the obstacle. The obstacle was removed. The political track moved forward. The Glasgow Herald, on the 29th of December 2017, picked up a Dublin State Papers release and printed a short article. 3 months after the ambush, the article reported, a priest in Dungannon had passed a rumour to the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. The rumour said the IRA team had been set up by Gerry Adams himself. If the Herald is right, Gerry Adams did not betray the East Tyrone Brigade out of malice. He betrayed them because his strategy had moved past them, and theirs had not. Jim Liner believed that the war could only be won by the bomb. Gerry Adams believed it could only be won at the table. They were both members of the same organisation, and both, in their separate ways, were correct. But only one of them lived long enough to find out which strategy worked. The funeral photograph from Carrickmore in May 1987 caught the moment that the other strategy died, carried by the man who had killed it.